Hi. Before we got started in our reading today, I thought I'd show you a couple more of the carvings done by my Uncle J.C. This is of a man and a woman, and it's actually not his most polished work, but it might give you a little bit of an idea of what the people in our story look like in his mind. So we're ready for A Day of Rest, Chapter 5. And here's a picture I wanted to show you. That's of a man whittling also. When the singing began, the men had moved over into the shade of the pines where the wagons were drawn up. One of the men seemed to be doing something with his horse, but the others leaned against the wagons or just stood forming a circle facing each other. Glancing up at Mrs. Campbell, Susan made sure that was the direction in which Mrs. Campbell was looking, so worriedly before she turned and looked back at the men. There was nothing about the men to worry anyone. They weren't talking so loud that you could hear them. Except for a sudden burst of laughter in the silence between songs, you would not know they were telling stories. They were evidently enjoying the stories. You could see they were relaxed and having a good time. All of them except Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell wasn't having a good time. He wasn't listening or laughing. He had turned a little to the side and was coughing from the bottom of his feet, it seemed. The coughing was so violent that the spare frame was bowed almost in the middle. Recovering from the spasm of coughing, Mr. Campbell stood up and cleared his throat and spat into the bushes. The worried look continued on the kind, motherly face of Mrs. Campbell, causing Susan to look again at Mr. Campbell. Susan didn't see anything to worry about. Mr. Campbell was usually coughing. He had been coughing just like that when Susan had been over to visit the Campbells just the week before. Except then, Mr. Campbell had been sitting on a stump in the front yard whittling. For several days before Susan visited the Campbells, her head had been itching, and Aunt Mary had become convinced that Susan had lice, even though she couldn't see any of them herself. Maribel Campbell also has lice, Douglas said as he looked up at Aunt Mary. Daisy Bell plans to wash Maribel's head in kerosene on Saturday. I think she would wash Susan's head also if Susan was there. So the next Saturday, Dad took Bert and Susan over to the Campbells. When Susan and Bert walked around to the back porch, Mrs. Campbell already had a bowl of kerosene on the stand in the backyard. She rubbed the oil into Susan's hair, then in the hair of her 8-year-old daughter, Maribel. Then she rubbed the oil into her own hair. Mrs. Campbell got warm water and strong soap and washed Susan's hair and rinsed it. She told Susan to go sit in the sun until her hair dried while she worked on Maribel's hair. In the front yard, Bert was sitting with Mr. Campbell and the two boys. Normally, when Susan visited the Campbells, Mr. Campbell was not there. During the week, he would go and be at work, but on Saturdays, he usually took his boys out hunting for rabbits or squirrels. But this Saturday, he was feeling poorly. So he sat on a stump whittling a rattle from a short length of a cedar branch and talking to his two boys about what they should be doing. Bruce, the 14-year-old, sat hunched on a rock whittling to the same tempo as his dad and saying, "Yes, sir," at the appropriate intervals. Jake, the 12-year-old, leaned against a tree and idly threw sticks out into the open field beside the house, trying to interest the spotted beagles in fetching. The two hounds, their extended tongues dripping saliva with every breath, rolled their weary brown eyes in the direction that the sticks landed, but remained sprawled on the ground at the boys' feet. Bert had his knife out, putting some finishing touches on a willow whistle he had made the night before. Ever so often, Mr. Campbell would stop talking, put down his knife, and turn around on the stump and cough. He coughed and coughed, racking coughs that left him pale and listless. In between coughs, he spat. Mr. Campbell worked in the mines. Susan knew that because her dad took him to the train. Douglas had one of the few cars in the area, and every morning at 5 days a week, he picked up miners that lived in the Willow Creek Junction area and took them to the Steeles, where they caught the train down the holler to the entrance of the mines. Once her dad had taken Susan with him as he picked up the miners. It had been quite dark when her dad shook Susan. Susan, knowing that he wouldn't wait, had jumped out of bed and started dressing, keeping her eyes shut, trying to retain the comfort of sleep while all the time making the motions of being awake. The miners, as they seated themselves in the car, were also sleepy. With hardly more than a grunt for a greeting, they dropped into the back seat and resumed their sleeping for the 10-mile ride to the Steeles, where they silently transferred to the train along with the other silent men from other cars. In the evening, however, when Douglas met the returning train, the miners leaving the train were awake. One after another, the men emerged from the train, coughing and spitting and joking. Some who got into the waiting cars for the ride back to their homes still had the black dust from the mines on their faces and clothes, but the men who rode with Douglas had showered and changed to clean clothes at the mines. Only the rims of their eyes and noses were outlined in black. "Susan, you're not watching the performers." Mrs. Campbell's voice broke into Susan's thoughts. "Maybe you would rather go over there and sit with Maribel." She nodded in the direction where Maribel sat, on the ground. "No, ma'am," Susan objected. "Aunt Mary said I was not to get the dress dirty." "Oh, I see." Mrs. Campbell easily understood the problem and made no further suggestions. But Susan looked longingly at the girls seated beneath the black oak that shaded the playground to the south of the schoolhouse. They looked so cool and comfortable in their print dresses and matching bonnets. In contrast, Susan was hot. That sun beating down on the part of her hair was blistering. She wished she had her bonnet from its hiding place. She leaned her head forward to give some relief to the top of her head, but soon the part in the back was burning. Susan tried turning her head from side to side, but couldn't hold it that way long enough to get any relief from the sun. "Susan, you're squirming," Mrs. Weaver spoke softly in reprimand. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm hot," Susan explained. "I'm hot too, Susan. I don't know what we can do about it unless we go home." Home! To Susan, home sounded like the coolest, most wonderful place in the world. She slid out of the chair. "I'm going home, ma'am." "By yourself?" Mrs. Weaver looked around with motherly concern. "No, ma'am. Bert brought me. He'll take me home." "Be careful on the highway, Susan," warned Mrs. Weaver. "And don't stop and talk to strangers," Mrs. Campbell added. "We walk on the bank," Susan replied primly, "and we never talk to strangers." "That's good," Mrs. Weaver approved. Both women nodded to show their agreement with this policy. They watched Susan until she joined the group where Bert was playing marbles, before letting their attention wander back to the performers. And that is the end of chapter 5.